Imagine being so famous, so celebrated, that an entire nation considers you a living monument. For over 4 decades, Gérard Depardieu wasn't just an actor, he was French cinema personified. With more than 200 films, collaborations with every legendary director, and a presence so commanding that presidents sought his friendship, he seemed absolutely untouchable. But in 2023 and 2024, the world watched as one of cinema's greatest legends experienced a fall so dramatic, so complete, that it shocked even those who thought they'd seen everything. Secret recordings emerged that couldn't be explained away. Investigations in multiple countries intensified, and France itself, the nation that had protected him for decades, finally said enough. What really happened to Gérard Depardieu? How did someone so revered become so reviled? And why are we only now confronting truths that many insiders claim they knew for years? Today, we're examining one of the most dramatic falls from grace in modern entertainment history. This isn't about tearing down a legend for clicks, it's about understanding how celebrity, power, and cultural protection can shield harmful behavior for generations. And what finally breaks that shield? The story of Gérard Depardieu is a masterclass in how icons fall. Gérard Depardieu's story begins in the most unlikely way. Born in 1948 in Châteauroux, a modest town in central France, he grew up in genuine poverty. His father worked in sheet metal. His mother struggled to provide for 6 children. The family lived in cramped conditions, and young Gérard was what people politely called troubled, getting into fights, running with rough crowds, and showing little promise of anything remarkable. At age 16, he left home for Paris with almost nothing. Acting wasn't a dream, it was survival. He fell into theater classes almost by accident, but something transformative happened when he stepped on stage. All that raw energy, that working-class rage, that oversized personality suddenly had a channel by his early 20s. Depardieu was already making waves in French theater. Directors noticed something special in authenticity that couldn't be taught, a physicality that commanded attention, and an emotional range that could shift from tenderness to violence in seconds. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, but he was magnetic. His film career exploded in the 1970s. While American cinema had clean-cut leading men, French audiences embraced Depardieu's rough edges. His peasant appeal, his everyman quality, combined with artistic depth, he became the face of French cinema's creative renaissance. Working with masters like François Truffaut, Bertrand Blier, and Alain Resnais, the 1990 film Cyrano de Bergerac made him a global superstar. His performance as the eloquent poet with the famously large nose earned an Academy Award nomination and introduced him to audiences worldwide. Here was an actor who could handle classical text, physical comedy, romance, and tragedy often in the same scene. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Depardieu was everywhere. French period dramas, Hollywood comedies, Russian epics, television series, he worked constantly, sometimes appearing in a dozen films a year. He became wealthy, influential, and seemingly bulletproof. French presidents consulted him. Major brands sought his endorsement. He was treated not just as an actor, but as a cultural institution. But even during his peak years, there were shadows. Industry insiders spoke quietly about his drinking, his temper, his behavior toward women. These weren't public scandals, they were whispered warnings that never quite made it into print. Here's what makes the Depardieu story so troubling. Many people knew. For decades, stories circulated within French cinema about inappropriate behavior, aggressive conduct, and troubling incidents. But a powerful combination of factors kept these stories from becoming public accountability. First, there was his talent. In French culture, artistic genius has historically been granted enormous latitude. The idea of separating the art from the artist wasn't just accepted, it was expected. Great artists were understood to be complicated, difficult, even transgressive. These weren't character flaws. They were signs of authentic creative spirit. Second, there was his economic importance. Depardieu was a film industry unto himself. Producers knew that his name attached to a project virtually guaranteed financing and distribution. Entire production companies, crews, and secondary actors depended on films built around him. Challenging Depardieu meant risking livelihoods. Third, there was national pride. France took genuine pride in Depardieu as a cultural export. He represented French cinema to the world, and his success reflected well on the entire nation. To acknowledge serious character problems would be to tarnish something France valued deeply. In 1991, there were quiet allegations about inappropriate behavior during the filming of Green Card in the United States, but these never gained traction. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, actresses and crew members occasionally spoke carefully about uncomfortable experiences, but their accounts were dismissed as misunderstandings or exaggerations. His personal life showed increasing chaos. His marriage ended acrimoniously. His drinking became more public and problematic. In 2011, he made international headlines for urinating in the aisle of an airplane after being told he couldn't use the restroom during takeoff. Rather than being seen as evidence of serious issues, this incident was often treated as an amusing anecdote about an eccentric star. Then came 2012. When Depardieu renounced his French citizenship over tax policy and accepted Russian citizenship, personally granted by Vladimir Putin, the French public was outraged by what they saw as betrayal. But even this controversy didn't seriously damage his career. He continued working steadily, his films continued performing well, and the industry continued protecting him. Looking back, what's remarkable is the consistency of the pattern. Minor scandals would emerge, there would be brief controversy, and then everything would return to normal. Depardieu's position seemed unassailable. The first serious crack in Depardieu's armor came in August 2018. When actress Charlotte Arnould filed a formal criminal complaint with Paris prosecutors alleging sexual assault, Arnould, who was in her 20s at the time of the alleged incident, claimed that Depardieu assaulted her at his Parisian residence during what was supposed to be a professional meeting to discuss a theater project. French authorities opened a preliminary investigation. This was significant, not just another whispered allegation, but an official legal process. However, in January 2019, prosecutors initially closed the case, citing insufficient evidence to proceed with charges, but Arnould didn't back down. She appealed the decision, and in 2020, the investigation was reopened. This time, authorities appeared to take the matter more seriously, conducting new interviews and examining additional evidence. The fact that prosecutors reversed their initial decision suggested that the cultural moment had shifted. As news of the investigation spread, other women began sharing their experiences. Some spoke publicly, others through lawyers or journalists. The allegations spanned decades of Depardieu's career and described a pattern of behavior that allegedly included inappropriate touching, crude sexual remarks, and assault. In 2021, additional complaints were filed regarding incidents that allegedly occurred during film productions in other countries. Spanish authorities launched their own preliminary inquiries into events said to have taken place during shoots in Spain. What made these allegations particularly compelling was their consistency across time, geography, and circumstance. These weren't coordinated attacks from a single source. They were independent accounts from women who often didn't know each other, describing similar patterns of behavior separated by years or decades. Depardieu's legal team issued strong denials, characterizing the accusations as false and motivated by attempts to exploit his fame. Some of his longtime collaborators defended him publicly, arguing that he was being unfairly targeted and that his artistic legacy shouldn't be destroyed by unproven allegations, but the broader cultural context was changing. Movements addressing sexual harassment and assault in various industries had created new frameworks for discussing power, consent, and accountability. Behaviors that had once been dismissed as merely inappropriate were being reconsidered as potentially criminal. French media, which had historically been protective of celebrity privacy, began covering the allegations more extensively. Feminist organizations called for thorough investigations and pushed back against the traditional separation of artist and art. The conversation was shifting from "can we prove these specific allegations?" to "why has this pattern of behavior been tolerated for so long?" If you want to pinpoint the exact moment when Gérard Depardieu's fall became irreversible, it was December 7, 2023 that evening. The French investigative television program, Complement D, Inquiet broadcast, a documentary that would change everything. The documentary included footage secretly recorded during Depardieu's 2018 trip to North Korea for a travel documentary project. In these recordings, captured without his knowledge, Depardieu was heard making explicit sexual comments about women and minors, including remarks about a young girl he observed riding a horse. The language was crude, degrading, and impossible to contextualize as anything other than deeply inappropriate. The impact was immediate and devastating. This wasn't an allegation that could be disputed or defended. It was Depardieu in his own voice, displaying exactly the kind of attitudes that accusers had been describing for years. The recordings provided a window into how he spoke when he thought no one was listening, and what they revealed was shocking even to those who had suspected problems. Within hours of the broadcast, social media exploded with reactions. French citizens who had defended him as a national treasure expressed disgust and betrayal. Women's rights organizations called for immediate action, and crucially, political leaders who had previously avoided commenting felt compelled to respond. President Emmanuel Macron, who had maintained silence during the investigations, issued a statement describing the footage as shocking and emphasizing that artistic talent could never justify predatory behavior. This was significant. The French president was effectively withdrawing the state's protection from someone who had been considered a cultural monument. The César Awards, France's equivalent of the Oscars, faced immediate pressure. Depardieu had won 2 César Awards and received 14 nominations throughout his career. Protesters demanded that his past honors be reconsidered and that he be formally disavowed by the organization. The Film Academy, which had historically resisted such calls, suddenly found itself unable to defend its previous honoree. French television, NETWORKS, began pulling his films from scheduled broadcasts. Streaming platforms added content warnings or removed titles entirely. Publishers delayed or canceled book releases related to him. The cultural infrastructure that had elevated and protected Depardieu for 4 decades began dismantling his legacy with remarkable speed. International reaction was equally severe. The footage was reported globally, and Depardieu's name became synonymous with a broader conversation about how entertainment industries enable and protect powerful predators. He became a case study in accountability delayed but finally arriving. What made this moment so definitive was its clarity. Defenders could no longer claim ambiguity or cultural misunderstanding. The footage removed all deniability and forced even his most loyal supporters to confront uncomfortable truths about someone they had admired. That Depardieu scandal triggered something larger than one actor's fall. It forced France into an overdue examination of how its cultural institutions handle powerful men accused of serious misconduct for generations. France had maintained a different approach to celebrity scandal than Anglo-American cultures. Privacy was valued. Personal lives were considered separate from professional achievements, and artists were granted special dispensation for behavior that would destroy others' careers. This wasn't just media practice, it was cultural philosophy. This attitude was perhaps most visible in France's continued embrace of filmmaker Roman Polanski, who fled the United States decades ago to avoid sentencing for assaulting a minor. Despite international controversy, Polanski continued working in France, winning major awards and receiving support from prominent cultural figures. His defenders argued that his artistic contributions mattered more than his criminal past. The Depardieu case challenged this framework in ways that Polanski's never quite did, perhaps because the footage made denial impossible, or because cultural attitudes had finally shifted enough that the old arguments no longer held. Feminist organizations and activists seized the moment to push for systemic changes. They called for reforms in how the film industry handles complaints, for ending the practice of separating artists from art when the artist's behavior causes real harm, and for creating better protections for women working in entertainment. Some French intellectuals and cultural figures pushed back, arguing that France was importing American-style Puritanism and cancel culture that threatened artistic freedom. They warned that destroying reputations based on allegations without convictions was dangerous, and that France shouldn't abandon its traditions of privacy and artistic liberty. But these defenses rang increasingly hollow, especially in light of the documentary footage. This wasn't about Puritanism or privacy, it was about accountability for behavior that Depardieu himself had displayed. Publicly, the conversation expanded beyond Depardieu to examine other protected figures in French culture. Who else had been shielded by their talent or importance? What other open secrets existed within French cinema, theater, and arts? How many women had been silenced or dismissed over the years? French film schools began discussing consent training and power dynamics in their curricula. Industry organizations developed new reporting mechanisms for harassment and assault. And crucially, younger generations of French artists began speaking out about wanting to create a different kind of cultural industry, one where talent doesn't excuse harm. Gérard Depardieu faces ongoing legal investigations in France regarding multiple allegations. Prosecutors continue examining evidence and conducting interviews. While he has not been formally charged with crimes, the investigations remain active and serious. His career has effectively ended. New projects have been canceled. Distribution companies have shelved completed films. His presence has become toxic for any production seeking financing or audiences. At an age when many acclaimed actors enjoy victory laps and lifetime achievement honors, Depardieu finds himself isolated and persona non grata. Financially, the impact has been significant. His property holdings and businesses have come under scrutiny. Endorsement deals have evaporated. The lucrative career that once seemed perpetually self-sustaining has dried up almost overnight. His personal relationships within the industry have also fractured. Some longtime collaborators have publicly distanced themselves. Others have issued carefully worded statements that essentially withdraw their previous support without explicitly condemning him. Depardieu himself has remained largely out of public view, issuing statements only through lawyers denying wrongdoing and characterizing himself as a victim of false accusations. He has not given substantial interviews or made public appearances to address the allegations directly. The cultural reassessment of his work continues. Film scholars and critics debate how to contextualize his performances now that his off-screen behavior has been exposed. Can audiences still appreciate Cyrano de Bergerac knowing what we now know? Should his films be studied as historical documents of a particular era in cinema, while acknowledging the problematic nature of the actor? These aren't easy questions, and the French cultural establishment is still grappling with answers. What seems clear is that there will be no redemption arc for Gérard Depardieu. Unlike some figures who face scandal, apologize, and eventually rebuild careers, Depardieu's age, the severity of the allegations, and the existence of the recorded footage make any comeback virtually impossible. The fall of Gérard Depardieu is a cautionary tale about the dangers of making anyone untouchable. For 40 years, his talent was used to justify overlooking behavior that should have ended his career decades earlier. His importance to French cinema became an excuse for not holding him accountable, and his celebrity created a shield that protected him until that shield finally, catastrophically, failed. That what his downfall reveals isn't just one man's misconduct. It's an entire system designed to protect powerful people at the expense of those with less power. It shows how cultural institutions can become complicit in enabling harm by valuing artistic legacy over human dignity. And it demonstrates how long injustice can persist when societies collectively decide that certain people are too important to challenge. But his fall also shows that accountability, while sometimes delayed, can eventually arrive. The protections that seemed impenetrable weren't actually permanent. The cultural attitudes that shielded problematic behavior can change, and victims who were ignored or dismissed for years can ultimately be heard and believed. The Depardieu scandal represents a painful but necessary reckoning with how it has treated allegations against celebrated figures. The conversation has moved beyond one actor to examine broader questions about power protection and who benefits from systems that privilege art over accountability. Gérard Depardieu's legacy is now inextricably tied to his downfall. Future generations will remember him not just for Cyrano or his 200 films, but as an example of how talent and fame can enable harm, and how even the mightiest reputations can crumble when truth finally breaks through. The question isn't whether he deserved to fulfill the allegations, and his own recorded words answered that. The question is why it took so long, and what that delay cost the women whose voices were ignored for decades while the world celebrated. A man who didn't deserve their admiration.